With you. Friends, for the next several months, we're going to be reading at Mass from Paul's great letter to the Romans. You might wonder why the church is asking us to spend so much time with this particular letter. Well, Paul never wrote a more thorough and searching account of the Christian thing than this communique to the little Christian community in Rome, sometime maybe in the 50s or early 60s of the first century. If you've been to Rome, you might have wandered through the picturesque little neighborhood called Trastevere. It's a region right across the Tiber from the Roman Forum. And during ancient times, this was a Jewish quarter. It's likely that this is where the first Christians, coming out of this Jewish matrix, would have gathered. And so at some point in the 50s, let's say, this letter of Paul to the Romans came into that neighborhood and was read. Romans is one of the last letters, perhaps the last that Paul wrote. And it's by far, as I say, his most involved and theologically articulate. Many great theologians over the centuries, from Augustine to Luther to Thomas Aquinas and Karl Barth, have made it central to their thought. Okay, if we could distill then one great idea from this letter of Paul, what would it be? Well, though he speaks of many important themes, there's little doubt that justification was his central preoccupation. Justification. As a rabbi trained by the great Gamaliel, Paul, Shaul of Tarsus, would have heard a great deal about mishpat. That's the Hebrew word for righteousness or justice. As a Greek trained in classical philosophy, undoubtedly young Shaul of Tarsus received a classical Greek education too. He would have heard the term dikaiosune, Greek for setting right. That's the word he uses in the letter to the Romans, written, of course, in Greek. Mishpat, dikaiosune, justification, have to do with the process by which, listen, someone who is not right with God becomes right with God. Dikaiosune, justification, has to do with the process by which we are rectified or straightened out in regard to God. Now, this implies, of course, and Paul was one of the first people to talk about this, that we are off kilter, that we are now unjustified, out of line. We're close now to what the church will eventually refer to as the doctrine of original sin. The claim that all is not right with us. That our minds, our wills, yes, even our bodies and passions are not aligned properly in regard to God. Now, I'll speak as a Catholic. As you know, this is a major point of dispute between classical Catholic theology and classical Protestant theology. I'll speak as a Catholic. This doesn't mean that we're total wrecks. So the great reformers talk about total depravity, that original sin has so broken us in relation to God that we're just totally depraved. But on the Catholic reading, it does indeed mean that we don't operate smoothly. We're offline. Now, I realize this might be annoying to the non-golfers listening to me, but golf analogies spring to my mind a lot when we talk about the spiritual life. Because you know, golfers know this, that in a proper swing, alignment is key. Your feet, your knees, your hips, your shoulders all have to be aligned properly to the target. If something's out of whack, and most of us bad amateur golfers, something is out of whack in our alignment, then when you swing, you're going to be off plane. And now listen, you will probably advance the ball, but not nearly as far as you want to and not nearly as straight as you want to. Well, something similar obtains in the spiritual order. When we are kinky, off-kilter, offline, twisted, we're not lost. It's not hopeless, but we don't run right in regard to God. Things don't flow properly. Let me stay with that image for a bit. Think of a system of pipes meant to conduce water. What's necessary for these pipes? Well, they've got to be straightened out. They might gently curve and so on, but they have to be basically straightened out, or the water won't flow through them. What will stop the water? But if the pipes kind of turn back on themselves, they become collapsed or kinky or off-kilter, and it blocks the flow of the water. So, are we, because of original sin? God's life is meant to flow into us and flow through us to the world. But we are, in Paul's language, unjustified, unrectified, kinky, off-kilter. And so the divine life, the divine grace can't flow into us and can't flow through us to the world. Our spiritual and moral alignment is off. And that's why we shouldn't be surprised that our spiritual and moral lives are unsatisfying. It's true of most of us, isn't it? In fact, Paul said, we've all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. It's true of all of us that we're not the people we want to be. Okay. What is it on the biblical reading that's caused this problem? Why are we unjustified? Well, here's Paul's answer. Lack of faith. Lack of faith. Now, to get at this, don't think of faith here primarily as assenting to propositions. That's a derivative sense of faith, that I have faith in these beliefs and creeds and propositions, and that's true. But think of it now as something far more existential. Faith, for Paul, means trust in the Lord. Trust, confidence, turning one's life over to the direction of God and living for His purposes, abiding by His plans. You know what faith is? I'll use again a phrase I've used a lot before with you. Realizing your life is not about you. No, your life belongs to God. Your life is ingredient in God's plans and purposes. You trust in the Lord that He will work through you. Now, see what happens when you have faith. It's as though you relax. You breathe deeply. You unwind some of these kinky elements within your own soul, and you allow thereby the grace of God to flow into you and through you into the world. Relax. Trust. Have faith. And God's grace will flow. Remember that great line from Ephesians chapter 6. There's a power already at work in you that can do infinitely more than you can ask or imagine. Well, the point is, trust it. Trust it. See, here's the problem. Most of us who lack faith feel that we have to justify ourselves. See, we have to make our lives meaningful. We've got to accomplish it. Now, what that does, and Paul, he's dead right about this. What that does is it turns us even more tightly in around ourselves. It's like someone who's caught in quicksand, and the more he struggles, the more he's drawn under. I will justify myself. I'll find the path. I'll do it. No, you just make your inner life more closed in and more cramped. So what's the key to justification? Paul's great answer: trust, faith. And here, his model is the great father in faith, Abraham. Rabbi Shaul, St. Paul, goes back here to the founding figure in Israel, the first Israelite. As God forms a people after his own heart, he chooses Abraham. Listen now to Paul's description. Abraham believed, trusted, hoping against hope that he'd become the father of many nations. He did not weaken in faith when he considered his own body as already dead and the dead womb of Sarah. Paul's referring here to that great promise given to Abraham that though he was an old man, though his wife was an old lady, they would have a son, and through that son, the promise would be fulfilled. Abraham trusted that word. Silly, foolish, yeah, probably in the eyes of the world, but Abraham trusted, and that allowed the divine life to flow through him. It allowed the divine plan to be fulfilled through him. And now here's the payoff. Here's the point of this first reading. In some ways, the whole point of the letter to the Romans. Paul said, quote, this faith, was credited to him as righteousness, dikaiosune, mishpat, justice, right ordering. You see what he's saying? In the measure that Abraham had faith, he trusted, he became justified. This was the act that straightened him out and made him a vehicle of God's grace. Now, you say, okay, that's of some antiquarian interest, I suppose. Not as Paul sees it. Because Abraham is the first Israelite. The church, those who believe in Jesus Christ, are the new Israel, grafted on to the family formed around Abraham. And so we, too, are shaped by this same faith. Listen to Paul again. It was also for us to whom it will be credited, who believe in the one who raised Jesus from the dead. Well, that's all of us. It's all of you listening to me. In the measure that you can put your trust in the God who raised Jesus from the dead, you will be justified, straightened out, set right. And it's good news not just for you, it's good news for the world, because now God's life will flow through you. There's not much in the Bible, friends, more important than this. There's not much that's more central. It's the one thing Paul wanted to tell that community in Rome. And so I say it to you now. You want to be justified? Have faith. Trust in the Lord. And God bless you. Peace be with you. Friends, last week I plunged for the second time into the world of the Reddit AMA. That means Ask Me Anything. Now, if you don't know what Reddit is, it's a web forum, one of the most popular in the world. And this AMA thing, Ask Me Anything, is a forum in which a person makes himself available to respond to any question anybody wants to ask. I've said before, it's like the quadlibetal questions in the Middle Ages. So when a professor would come into the room, and quadlibet in Latin just means whatever you want. And so the professor would entertain any question from the floor. Well, things, trust me, they're a little more rough and ready on the internet, but it's the same kind of idea. Now, I'm saying this not because I'm particularly famous, because I'm quite sure 98% of people on Reddit AMA don't know me. But now for the second time, we did it last year, for the second time, I had one of the most popular AMAs of the year. Last year, I was just behind Bill Gates and Jordan Peterson. This year, as I record these words, I'm behind, again, Bill Gates was number one. He's really big on Reddit AMA. But I'm just about to catch Bernie Sanders. And again, I'm saying it not because I'm that famous, but young people are interested in the questions of religion. They're interested in the church. Now, trust me, go on it with some trepidation because you're going to find an awful lot of vile stuff on Reddit. So the audience is, I think demographically, it's largely young men between 18 and 30. So, you're going to expect a fair amount of kind of locker room stuff and a lot of vitriol, a lot of hatred, a lot of, frankly, childishness, et cetera, et cetera. However, you'll also find, if you can wade through all of that, you're also going to find, I think, a good deal of authentic religious insight, question, aspiration. You're going to hear a lot of energy around religious questions among young men, and I think that's good. Now, let me just say, the 4 biggest themes that emerge, for sure, it's not that hard to see these patterns. The 4 biggest were the existence of God. Do you know that God exists? How can you show it? Secondly, how do you know that your religion is right compared to other religions? A third topic, hugely important for young people, homosexuality and the church's attitude toward it. So, no question about that. But the 4th area of interest is the one I want to talk about today. And man, was it clear on this Reddit AMA. Namely, the problem of suffering. How could God exist if there's so much wickedness and evil and pain and suffering in the world? Okay. I can't tell you how many participants in this forum pose some version of that question. By the way, they reminded me here a bit of Dostoevsky. You go back to the Brothers Karamazov, his greatest novel, and one of the characters, Alyosha, is very religious, but his brother, who's a fierce critic of religion, is trying to dissuade his brother, and so he brings up, and I think it's the most vivid presentation in all the literature of the world. He brings up these cases. Many of them, by the way, Dostoevsky took from real life, of children being tortured. Now, again, his purpose, the character's purpose was to disabuse his brother of his religious faith. And this is how he was trying to do it, by saying, look, how can you possibly believe in God if all this terrible stuff happens, including the torture of children? And there's just something that's uniquely horrific, right, about that. Well, on the Reddit AMA, now not with the same eloquence of Dostoevsky, but people brought up a lot with me. Children suffering, children sick, children indeed being tortured. Okay. I would say every single major theologian has wrestled precisely with this issue. And the reference to Dostoevsky makes clear a lot of our great artists have too. Now, how come I'm bringing all this up today? Why am I bringing up this interest of the Reddit AMA? Well, because of our readings for today. The first reading, taken from the book of the prophet Habakkuk, first of all, clearly indicates that people in biblical times wrestled with the very same issue. See, don't think for a second that somehow, we modern people have kind of cleverly uncovered this great objection. Believe me, it's been around from the beginning of religion, and you can hear it in the biblical authors themselves. Now, the prophet Habakkuk, not maybe a household name, he's one of the so-called minor prophets, just meaning that he has one of the shorter books in the prophetic literature. But he was prophesying and speaking, maybe even writing, in the period just prior to the Babylonian captivity. Now, that's a way of saying during a time when Israel was very on edge. It's great fear that this power was sort of amassing its forces and it was threatening the neighboring countries, including Israel. Imagine if there was a great international power that was at our borders and about to invade our country. Well, that's the mood of the time when Habakkuk was writing. So listen to him now. And I think this could come right out of the Reddit AMA. This could come right out of young people today. Listen to him. How long, O Lord? I cry for help, but you do not listen. I cry out to you violence, but you do not intervene. Why do you let me see ruin? Why must I look at misery? Destruction and violence are before me. Okay, pretty blunt, pretty clear. Does he believe in God? Yes, of course. He's a biblical prophet. But is he feeling the press of this issue as powerfully as anybody on the Reddit AMA? Absolutely. Don't think for a second that, the authors of the Bible, they just had all this figured out. No problem. Here's my facile little argument. I got this whole thing figured out. Nothing can be further from the truth. Believers in God have always wrestled, especially with this difficulty. Again, doubt me, open up the book of the Psalms. And as I've said often, in the Psalms you can see everything. You see ecstasy, you see love, you see joy, you see ebullience, and you see anguish, broken hearts, and this angry crying out to God. The Bible knows all about it. Okay, does the Bible leave us there? No. Listen as we go on now with Habakkuk. Then the Lord answered me and said, write down the vision clearly upon the tablets, so that one can read it readily. For the vision still has its time, presses on to fulfillment. It will not disappoint. If it delays, wait for it. It will surely come. Friends, here we catch a glimpse of what the Bible means by faith. As I've said to you repeatedly, authentic faith has nothing to do with naivete or gullibility. Don't listen to the new atheists on this. That has nothing to do with authentic faith. I just accept any old nonsense on the basis of no evidence. No, that's not faith. That's credulity, gullibility, naivete. That's not it. Rather, listen now, authentic faith is a confidence in God. It's a reliance upon God, even when we can't adequately see or understand what God is about. Let me say it again. Faith is a confidence in God, a reliance upon God, even when we can't adequately see or understand what God is about. Think for a second too, everybody. Why would we think that we, with our tiny, finite minds, could ever fully understand the will and purpose of God? There's something, I totally get the emotional power behind this argument from suffering, innocent suffering. I get it, of course. I feel as much as anybody. But at the same time, there's something a little bit arrogant about it too. That obviously there's no meaning here. Well, how can we possibly say that? How could our little tiny minds possibly fathom the purposes of an infinite mind? It's interesting. One of the most famous lines in the Old Testament is found in this section of Habakkuk, though we don't hear from it today in our readings. But this line was picked up by St. Paul in his letter to the Romans, and hence had a powerful role in Christian history. The line I'm referring to is this: the just man shall live by faith. The just man shall live by faith. What does that mean? That means that the person of God is living not in the attitude of, I got this all under control. I got my life figured out. I know what's going on. I'm in charge. That kind of, hyper-confident, overconfident humanism. Rather, the righteous person lives by this confidence in the will and purpose of God. Here's something that came up in the Reddit AMA, and it's a very old thing in philosophy, but a lot of the young people brought it up to me again. They say, solve this dilemma for me, Bishop. How could God possibly be at the same time all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-loving if there's evil? Right? If he's all-knowing, he'd know about it. If he's all-powerful, he could do something about it. If he's all-loving, he'd want to do something about it, right? Therefore, if he's all three of those things, evil would not exist. Good argument? It's a darn good argument. It's a darn good argument. Very persuasive argument. Been used up and down the centuries. But here's the problem. It overlooks a fourth possibility. A possibility perceived by the person of faith, namely this. God can permit evil so as to bring about a greater good. Evil can be allowed as part of God's design, even though we can never fully grasp the contours and patterns of that design. This easy? Of course not. Faith always involves a certain walking in the dark. But what power it brings us. Listen now as I close, just one line from the Gospels, from the Gospel for today. The apostles say to the Lord, "Increase our faith." And Jesus replies, "If you had the faith the size of a mustard seed, you would say to this mulberry tree, 'Be uprooted and planted in the sea,' and it would obey you." Now, what's being said here? Not that we're going to, watch me as I make trees, become uprooted. No, the point here is that confidence in God's plan, confidence in God's purpose, unleashes enormous power in your own life and in the lives of those around you. It permits you to live in a free and spiritually expansive way. It gives you the power to endure whatever may come. And that's why the just person shall live by faith. That, it seems to me, everybody, is the biblical answer to this great and ancient problem. And God bless you.
Peace be with you. Friends, today is the second Sunday of Easter, Divine Mercy Sunday, so designated by St. John Paul II, not long before he died. As a young man, Karl Wojtyła cultivated a devotion to Sister Faustina Kowalska, a young nun who died in Krakow in 1938, had been gifted with extraordinary visions and experiences of the Lord Jesus. I had the privilege when I was filming over in Krakow to visit the convent where Faustina was, and to see, actually not far from the quarry where the young John Paul II worked. So I was able to look into that world a bit. The most famous of the visions that Faustina had of Jesus was of the Lord revealing his Sacred Heart, from which came rays of light, red and white, which she interpreted as a radiating forth of the divine mercy. The pale light, the white light, signified baptism, and the red light signified the Eucharist, the blood of the Eucharist. Now, it struck young Karl Wojtyła and eventually John Paul II as significant that Faustina died on the eve of Poland's crucifixion at the hands of the Nazis, who invaded September 1, 1939, the year after she died. And then the ongoing crucifixion of the Poles by the communists. John Paul, as we know, recognized the 20th century as perhaps the cruelest century in human history, the one most marked by violence, by genocide, by deep hatred. And therefore what? Therefore the century most in need of the divine mercy. And he saw in the visions of Faustina a sign, an indication that God wanted very specially to bestow on the 20th century his mercy. As we know, as Pope, John Paul was able to make the devotion to Sister Faustina, and of course he canonized her as Saint Faustina, to make the devotion known throughout the world. So now there are people all over the planet who pray this chaplet of the divine mercy, pledging their trust in Jesus. And again, John Paul designated this Sunday the Sunday after Easter, as Divine Mercy Sunday. So what do we mean when we say mercy? Well, the word mercy is an Englishing of misericordia, which designates the suffering of the heart. Cor in Latin meaning heart, miseria, suffering. Mercy, therefore, is a type of compassion. That word from cum patior in Latin, which means I suffer with. It's a deep, loving identification with people in their suffering, you might say. That's mercy. It's identical to what the Old Testament authors refer to as God's chesed, or tender mercy. It is, if you want, the characteristic of God, for God is love. Now see, Pope Francis has been very strong in this, hasn't he? As he keeps stressing the divine mercy as not just one attribute among many, but as the very essence and nature of God. What we say is that the love that obtains among the Trinitarian persons spills over into God's love for the world that he makes. That's God's chesed, his tender mercy, his compassionate love. That's what Faustina saw, pouring forth from the heart of Christ. Take a good look at Psalm 118 when you have a chance. Let the house of Israel say, his mercy endures forever. Let the house of Aaron say, his mercy endures forever. Let those who fear the Lord say, his mercy endures forever. And on it goes, Psalm 118. Imagine it being sung back in ancient times. And this refrain repeated over and over again. His mercy, his chesed, his tender love, endures forever. Think of a mother's love for her children. It's maybe the great biblical metaphor. Could you ever imagine a mother becoming indifferent to one of her offspring? Yet, Isaiah says, even if she forgets, it's unthinkable, but even if she forgets, God will never forget his own. Now put that in more philosophical language. Nothing in the world would exist were it not every moment actively willed into being by God. That's a metaphysical truth, right? Nothing in the finite contingent world would exist were it not finally for the causal influence of God. Not just way back when, but I mean from moment to moment. God, who has no need of anything, nevertheless, from moment to moment, sustains the universe in a great act of tender mercy, a great act of love. Now, here's a famous question raised a lot today, probably in the wake of Pope Francis' great stress on mercy. Is God's mercy opposed to his justice or his truth? Well, I'll keep my philosopher's hat on for a minute. Such an opposition would be metaphysically impossible. Why? For God is simple, and therefore all his attributes are identical to his essence, and hence to one another. It's a bit of a technical point, but it's an interesting point. So we say that God has a number of attributes. We say God is love, God is mercy, God is justice, God is powerful, God is this and that. But we can't really think of those as separate realities because God, in his very essence, is simple. God is one. God is absolute. And therefore, the attributes are really all identical to one another. To use an image I've used before with you, it's like a prism. The white light comes through a prism and then breaks into different colors. Well, see, we see the different divine attributes like the colors that are broken through a prism. But see, in itself, it's all one great white light. You know, the second reading for today makes this point admirably about the coming together of God's mercy and justice. John, as we know, more than really any other New Testament author, consistently sings of the love of God made manifest in Jesus. I mean, he's the great singer of the hymn of the divine mercy. It's John who gives us the unsurpassably great formula that God is love. It's not just something God has or that God does. It's what God is. But now listen now to make this point about mercy and justice coming together. How is this love made manifest in us? How is it instantiated? Well, John tells us now in this first letter. Precisely through following the Lord's commands. Listen now to him. For the love of God is this, that we keep his commandments. In this way, we know that we love the children of God when we love God and obey his commandments. See, here's how it works. In his mercy, God wants to share his life with us. But that life is a life of love. That's all it is. And therefore, it issues forth how? Precisely as a command to love. Does that make sense? God's mercy, sharing of his life, will issue forth in us, to us, as a command to love. Without the fulfillment of the command to love, it remains just an abstraction. Oh, I'm not into truth or justice, I'm into mercy. It can't work that way. God's mercy will issue forth as a commandment to love, to be just. But perhaps there's no greater manifestation of the divine mercy than the forgiveness of sins. Our magnificent gospel for today, taken from the 20th chapter of John, lays this truth out with admirable clarity. We're in the upper room with the disciples. Those who had, at the moment of truth, denied, betrayed, and abandoned their master. Fear, and I would say shame, are probably their ruling passions at the moment. Jesus, we are told, then came and stood in their midst. When they saw him, their fear must have intensified. Why? Well, undoubtedly he's back for some kind of revenge. But instead, he spoke that simple word, shalom, peace, which sums up everything God wanted for his people throughout the Bible. Shalom, it means physical well-being, spiritual well-being. It means everything good at every level. Indeed, the risen Jesus showed his hands and side, lest they forget what the world and they did to him. But he is not followed with a word of blame or retribution, only with a word of mercy. But then, listen now, the extraordinary commission. The risen Jesus breathes on them and says, receive the Holy Spirit. Whose sins you forgive are forgiven them, and whose sins you retain are retained. In other words, what's happening here? Jesus' mercy is communicated to his disciples, who in turn are being sent to communicate it to all the world. And this is the foundation for the sacrament of penance, which has existed in the church from that moment to the present day. How? As the privileged vehicle of the divine mercy. That's it. That's the vehicle, the privileged vehicle of the divine mercy, is the sacrament of penance. When G.K. Chesterton was asked why he became a Catholic, he answered, to have my sins forgiven. See, he recognized this was the greatest grace the church can offer. It's not a burden, it's a grace, the grace of reconciliation, the restoration of the divine friendship, the forgiveness of our sins. But friends, we all know this, how this great sacrament has fallen into disuse. I think it might be the central tragedy of the post-conciliar years. Again, not for a second to blame Vatican II, which does nothing to discourage penance. But the central tragedy, perhaps, of the post-conciliar years is the falling off of this sacrament. Notice, please, Pope Francis has put a huge stress on it, both in his hearing of confessions and his going to confession. Remember that dramatic moment in St. Peter's when he left the liturgical procession and he went to a confession box, to a startled priest. Pope Francis wants to recover confession, again, not as a burden, but precisely as the privileged expression of the divine mercy. So, I would say, all of you listening to me today, on this Divine Mercy Sunday, revel in the divine mercy, but don't just revel in it. Don't just entertain it intellectually. I'd recommend all of you go to confession. It's the best way to bask in the divine mercy. And God bless you.
Peace be with you. Friends, we come once more to this great spiritual season of Lent, a time of preparation, self-examination, introspection. Lent is the earliest it's been since the mid-19th century. It's one of the earliest Easter seasons we've had in a long time. Well, Lent is a time to do the hard work of the Spirit. The hard work of the Spirit. If this seems strange or counterintuitive, just think of the numerous analogs in our ordinary experience. Athletes return year after year to training camp. Even professional football players go back to the fundamentals every summer. Baseball players now, as I record this homily, are about to return to spring training, and they once more go over how to swing the bat, how to throw the ball, how to hit the cutoff man. They do the basics. Musicians, even great high-level musicians, practice again and again, returning to the fundamentals. Many people slog through the hard work of keeping in physical shape, getting back every day to these fundamental moves. And so, why should the spiritual life be any different? Once again, on this first Sunday, the church brings us back to the desert with Jesus and brings us back to the garden in the book of Genesis. Let me talk first about that compelling story of Adam and Eve. What is it about this story that remains so fascinating to us after all these centuries? Well, it tells some of the most elemental truths that must be accepted and wrestled with in the spiritual life. The church brings us back to it over and over again because it's so fundamental. What do we notice in it? We notice that God planted a garden in Eden and placed the first humans there. What does God want for us? Life, and life to the full. That's what God wants. Never stop telling yourself that. I said last week that God is chesed. He's tender mercy, compassion. What does He want for us? Life. In this beautiful symbolic story, it's suggested through the use of the image of the garden, a place of delight, of color, of vitality, a place where our powers are energetically engaged. I've said to you before, the church fathers read Adam and Eve at play in the Garden of Eden as humanity at its best. The great permission that God gives. Now, we'll get to the prohibition. He does give a prohibition, but we mustn't overlook the tremendous permission He gives. Go eat of all the fruit of all the trees in the garden. The church fathers read this as an invitation to science, politics, art, culture, conversation, friendship, all the things that make life rich, all those ways that our powers are awakened and engaged. That's what God wants for us in this garden of delight. But there is also a prohibition. It is only from the fruit of the tree in the middle of the garden that God said, "You shall not eat it or even touch it, lest you die." What does this symbolic tree mean, and why is it placed at the very center of the garden? Look, if the garden means full human flourishing, if it means the engagement of our powers, what stands as the anchor and at the heart of that process? A keen sense of good and evil. I want to be a success as a politician. What must I know? I must know very keenly the difference between good and evil. I want to be a success as an artist. I mean now a spiritual success, not a commercial success. I've got to know the difference between right and wrong in the aesthetic order. I want to be a good friend. What must I know? I must know the difference between good and evil. Friends, the condition for the possibility of human flourishing is a very clear sense of the objective difference between right and wrong. Without that, the play of the garden becomes something terrible and destructive. Listen now. Whose prerogative is good and evil? Not ours. We're at play in the field of the Lord. Good. We're engaging our powers. Terrific. But we don't ourselves, through the power of our minds and wills, determine the difference between right and wrong. Rather, that belongs uniquely to God. You see what the story is saying? If God and His criterion, grounded in His own mind, remain at the center of your life, then it becomes a garden, a place of delight. But what happens now as the story unfolds? Adam and Eve, seduced by the serpent, see the fruit of this tree as something delightful, something alluring, and so they grasp it. They seize it for themselves. What have they done? They have said, we, in our freedom, our minds, our wills now become the criterion of good and evil. We will decide what's right and wrong. We will determine the difference between good and evil. This is at the heart of the disaster on the biblical reading. All of our agony and struggle in the spiritual sense flow from this fundamental mistake. Here's a detail that I know I've shared with you before, but I think it's so important. How does the serpent construe God as he seduces Adam and Eve? He says, oh, look, I know why he's prohibiting this tree. It's because if you eat of it, you'll be like him, knowing good and evil. He's jealous of you. Friends, that lie has been believed up and down the ages to the present day. It's the lie that God is a rival to us, that God's glory is bought at the expense of our agony. Only when we're put down is God elevated. See, all of that on the biblical reading is a lie, and it flows from the father of lies. It's precisely when we surrender to the objectivity of God's criterion of good and evil that we find life. We're not subjugated by this surrender. We're not belittled by it. We are elevated by it. The trouble is, all of us sinners, descendants spiritually of Adam and Eve, believe this same lie. What's the result of their eating of the tree? Expulsion from the garden. Don't read it as God falling into a snit, God becoming punitive and irrational. God is just mad they broke his arbitrary law, so he expelled them. No. The Bible speaks a kind of spiritual physics. See what I mean? Physics deals in these basic laws. If you do this, that will happen. You mix this chemical and that, something will happen. Well, something similar is true in the spiritual life. When you seize at the knowledge of good and evil, you make your will the criterion of right and wrong, you, ipso facto, leave the garden. Not because God's being difficult, it's just a fact of the spiritual life. the garden will become a place of lifelessness and aridity, a desert rather than a garden. Sound familiar? It should. This is our story. This is the human story to the present day. The dynamics of this garden are going on all the time right now. God holding out to us life and life to the full, but we stubbornly seizing at the knowledge of good and evil, we making ourselves the ground and criterion, turn the garden into a desert. Okay, it's true, we know it. But the story doesn't end there. The story culminates in the journey of the Son of God into that desert. When Jesus begins his public ministry, where does he go? Into the desert. What does it mean? It means he goes into our sin. He goes to accompany us in this place to which we've wandered. And there he confronts the devil. How beautifully now the church juxtaposes these stories. The devil tempting Adam and Eve, and now the devil tempting Jesus. And Jesus standing in the place of our sin. He holds out to him, of course, three classic paths. Three classic ways in the desert. When we've rejected God as the criterion of good and evil, we tend to wander in three typical ways. First, we make sensual pleasure the center of our concerns. We make eating, drinking, and sex our dominant preoccupations. What is this but a source of great mischief? For only God can legitimately fill the central position. That's why Jesus now confronts this temptation. The devil says, turn these stones into bread. I know how hungry you are. Make sensual pleasure the center of your life. On our behalf, in the desert, Jesus resists. Oh, once we've wandered into that arid place, we can make honor our central preoccupation no longer God, but our own reputation, being seen by everybody, admired, thought highly of. Well, Jesus confronts this too. The devil takes him to the parapet of the temple, the high point of the most important building in the most important city of the time. Everyone can see him. He's at the tip top of his society. That's where people who seek honor want to be. But Jesus resists this temptation too. He knows that the will of God must be central in human life. Finally, those of us who've wandered into the desert, who've turned away from making God the center of our lives, we tend to be tempted by power. Oh, from political dictators and tyrants to families and friendships, power is a deeply alluring thing. Well, Jesus confronts this temptation too. The devil takes him to the top of a high mountain and in one glance shows him all the kingdoms of the world. These I will give to you if you but bow down and worship me. Once God has been eliminated, this becomes a very powerful temptation. And Jesus, for us, resists it. Begone, Satan. God alone shall you serve. Friends, as Lent begins, here's the question to ask. What are you seeking? What are you making the center of your life? Is God clearly at that central place? If not, something else is tempting you. Pleasure, honor, power. Where are you in the desert? Cling to Jesus, who on your behalf resists and turns that desert back into a garden. And God bless you.